Welcome to Property Report UK, your trusted source for clear, independent analysis of the British housing market and the policies shaping the financial future of homeowners across the country. If you care about what's really happening behind the headlines, not just the announcements from Westminster, but the deeper forces affecting property values, mortgages, and household wealth, you're in exactly the right place. Today we're examining a topic that has begun quietly circulating in policy discussions and economic circles, but could have enormous consequences for millions of homeowners across Britain. It concerns one of the most important protections ever built into the UK tax system, a rule that, for decades, has helped the property ladder function. For generations, British homeowners have relied on a simple understanding. If you buy a home, live in it as your main residence, and later sell it, the profit you make from that sale is generally protected from taxation. That protection is known as Principal Private Residence Relief, often shortened to PRR. In practical terms, this relief means that when homeowners sell the property they live in, they typically don't have to pay capital gains tax on the increase in its value. This principle has played a major role in shaping the way the UK housing market works. Think about how the property ladder has traditionally operated. A young couple might start by buying a modest flat. Over several years they build equity through mortgage payments and, if the housing market rises, through increasing property values. When the time comes to move, perhaps to accommodate a growing family, they sell the flat and use the proceeds as a deposit on a larger home. The key point is that the gain from that first property can usually be reinvested without tax being deducted from it. That untaxed equity becomes the stepping stone that allows households to move up the ladder. The same principle works at the other end of the housing cycle. Many older homeowners eventually decide to downsize. After decades in a large family house, they may sell it and move into something smaller, releasing capital that can support retirement or help family members. This flow, first-time buyers moving up, older homeowners moving down, is part of what keeps the housing market moving. But recently, discussions inside government and among economic analysts have raised an important question: could this long-standing tax protection one day be reconsidered? The reason this topic is emerging now relates to the broader pressures facing the UK's public finances. Governments regularly review the tax system when budgets become strained, particularly during periods of high borrowing, rising public spending, or economic uncertainty. When policymakers search for new revenue sources, they often examine areas where large amounts of wealth are concentrated. In the UK, one of the most significant stores of household wealth is property. Housing equity, the difference between a home's value and the remaining mortgage, represents a huge portion of the nation's overall wealth. For that reason, tax experts and economists occasionally debate whether existing exemptions should remain untouched indefinitely. One proposal sometimes discussed in policy circles involves limiting or reforming Principal Private Residence Relief, which currently shields most homeowners from capital gains tax when selling their primary residence. Now, it's important to stress that debates about tax policy happen frequently, and not every idea becomes government policy. But understanding how such a change could affect the housing market helps explain why the topic generates so much concern whenever it is raised. To understand the potential impact, we first need to look at how capital gains tax works. Capital gains tax, often abbreviated as CGT, is normally applied when someone sells an asset that has increased in value. In the UK, it already applies to certain types of property, particularly second homes, buy-to-let investments, and holiday properties. For higher-rate taxpayers selling these types of residential properties, capital gains tax can reach significant levels. The tax is calculated based on the difference between the purchase price and the sale price, minus certain allowable costs and improvements. However, the property someone lives in as their primary residence is generally protected by PRR. That distinction is what has historically separated an investment property from a family home. But imagine, for a moment, a hypothetical scenario where that distinction was narrowed or removed. Let's consider a typical example. Suppose a homeowner purchased a house 10 years ago for £200,000. Over the decade they've paid their mortgage, maintained the property, and perhaps invested in improvements like a new kitchen or structural repairs. At the same time, the broader housing market has risen. The property is now worth £300,000. Under the current system, if that home is the owner's main residence, selling it would normally allow him to keep the entire £100,000 gain without paying capital gains tax. That gain often becomes the deposit for the next home. But in a scenario where PRR were reduced or removed, that gain could potentially fall within the capital gains tax system. If, hypothetically, the same £100,000 gain were taxed at rates similar to those applied to certain other residential property sales, the homeowner might face a tax bill based on that profit. The result would be that part of the equity generated by rising property values would go to the Treasury rather than entirely toward the homeowner's next purchase. For households planning to move up the ladder, that could affect the size of their deposit and therefore the type of property they can afford. And that is where economists begin to look at the broader consequences. The housing market is not just about individual transactions. It operates as a chain. When one household moves, another household buys their property. When that buyer moves later, another family steps in behind them. The entire system relies on mobility, people being able to move when their circumstances change. If moving becomes significantly more expensive due to taxation, some economists argue that fewer households may choose to sell. This is particularly relevant when considering downsizing. Imagine a couple who bought their home several decades ago when prices were far lower. Over time, property values may have increased dramatically. Their house might now be worth several £100,000 more than when they purchased it. In the current system, selling that property and downsizing allows them to release that equity without paying capital gains tax. They might move into a smaller home while using the remaining funds to support retirement or assist family members. But if selling triggered a large tax bill on the gain accumulated over many years, some homeowners might decide that moving simply isn't worth the cost. Economists sometimes refer to this situation as market lock-in. It describes a scenario where people stay in properties longer than they otherwise would, because selling would trigger a significant tax liability. When large numbers of homeowners delay selling, housing supply can tighten, particularly in certain segments of the market, such as larger family homes. Younger families searching for more space might then find fewer properties available. At the same time, reduced housing transactions can have wider economic effects. The property market supports a broad ecosystem of businesses. Estate agents, conveyancing solicitors, surveyors, removal firms, tradespeople, decorators, and many others all rely on housing turnover. When transaction volumes fall, activity across these industries can slow. This is why housing policy tends to attract such intense debate. Changes designed to increase government revenue in one area can sometimes have unexpected consequences elsewhere in the economy. Another factor to consider is that life events often force people to move regardless of market conditions. People relocate for work, experience family changes, or face financial challenges that require selling property. In those circumstances, taxation policies can have an even more direct financial impact on households navigating already difficult situations. Because of these complexities, most governments approach property taxation cautiously. Housing is not just another asset class, it is also where people live, raise families, and store much of their lifetime savings. For that reason, any discussion about potential changes to principal private residence relief tends to generate strong reactions from homeowners, economists, and policymakers alike. Supporters of reform sometimes argue that housing wealth has grown dramatically in recent decades and that the tax system should treat different forms of investment more consistently. Critics, on the other hand, argue that taxing gains on primary residences could discourage mobility and disrupt the functioning of the housing market. At the moment, PRR remains a central feature of the UK tax system. But debates about fiscal policy often evolve, especially when governments face difficult financial choices. That's why staying informed about these discussions is so important for homeowners and potential buyers alike. The property market is influenced not only by supply and demand, but also by mortgage rates, inflation, planning policy, and taxation. And when any one of those factors changes, the ripple effects can spread across the entire market. Here at Property Report UK, our goal is to break down those complex policy discussions into clear, understandable analysis so you can see how they might affect real households. Because behind every policy debate is a simple reality: millions of families rely on the stability of the housing market to plan their financial future. And understanding the potential risks, opportunities, and changes ahead is the first step in making informed decisions. If you found today's analysis useful, make sure you're subscribed to Property Report UK. We bring you regular updates on the latest developments in the UK housing market, government policy, interest rates, and the economic forces shaping property prices across the country. Don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone who wants clearer insight into what's really happening in the British property market. And as always, stay tuned because the story of the UK housing market is still unfolding, and we'll be here to guide you through every major development. Thanks for watching Property Report UK. We'll see you in the next update.